From the History of the Order of Magi, the Advent Trials. To say that the air and mood coiling its way through the stone halls of any Orium and Atalan once united, it doesn't matter which. The night before the final testing was tense and fraught with an almost oppressive weight, would be the understatement of all time. In the days leading up to the final testing, Magi adepts and their shepherd candidate companions often find themselves at odds with any semblance of relaxation and composure. That, coupled with the boiling blood of adolescence, can often, but not always, lend itself to an instance that, if the conditions are just right, might ignite. Little do these students know what awaits them on the other side, if they are called. And even more perilous will their lives become if, in the Advent trials, they succeed. But that is never a concern for those so young. Nevertheless, life, being the cruel teacher that it is, will be no less forgiving of their ignorance, masked as innocence. Chronicled by Myas Wynn. This is The First Noel by A. Diallo Jackson. A Moment in the Sun. Wylt. The afternoon's light was warming and bright, almost too bright, but never warm enough. It was an irony that too much of it always made it difficult to ever clearly see. "What are you doing?" Wylt asked, squinting. He stood at the center of the battle circle where kicked-up sawdust intended to soften the always hard and unforgiving solid rock floors swirled about. It danced in the sunbeams like tiny, frenetic firelight flies. No, it was less poetic than that. They looked like a million busy ants, made of light at least, swirling about with nowhere to truly go. So around and around they went. Across the room, Brid leaned casually against the archway at the entrance, her shoulder resting against centuries-old worn gray stone. She appeared to bathe in the sunlight that streamed down through the towering pillars just to the left, painting her in a soft golden glow. Wylt watched her, puzzled. She seemed removed from it all, as though her mind had wandered to some other time and place. The rays caught the messy strands of her blonde hair, the ones always left untied, as usual. She was never much a stickler for details. This moment, quiet and still, was a stark contrast to the Bridain Adair he knew. Abrasive, short-tempered, with a bent toward impatience, this was not the girl leaning against the wall right now. For once, she looked almost peaceful, her face turned to the warmth of the sun. He almost saw a smile. Not that Brid never smiled. She smiled often enough, though usually at the expense of someone else, which made all the difference in this moment. Her humor was as sharp and cutting as a warrior's sword. But now, here, there was no trace of smugness or a glimmer of mischievous wit across her face. She looked serene and present. For a fleeting moment, it was as though she was somewhere else entirely. "It's so..." She took a deep breath and heavy inhale. Warm. The exhale was more an ugh than an ah. Even so, her voice was softer than usual. Usually by this time of year, the cold is already set in. But this... She closed her eyes and took in another long, drawn breath, letting it fill her lungs. The next words came out breathy on an exaggerated exhale. Let me soak it in. Who knows how much longer it'll last? Ugh, I hate the cold. Well, Wylt began, raising an eyebrow. He felt relaxed because she was, a rare occurrence between the two of them. You chose the wrong place to live then, friend. The sudden movement of Brid's head snapping toward him began before he'd even finished speaking. All the sun and calm vanished in an instant. The sharpness of her glance cut through him like a blade through parchment. I didn't choose to live here, she said, her voice low and measured. She let a telling silence hang between them for a moment before adding, friend. Straightening her back, Brid's hand moved to the hilt of her sword. The sound it made as she drew it was the same as always, a clean metallic scrape. But this time, there was something different in the way it rang, something that promised that a lesson was about to be learned. Wylt swallowed, reaching his own hand down into the small, worn leather pouch hanging from his belt. A familiar rough and prickly object inside pressed against his palm. He took his stance, feet shifting into position. From the pouch he pulled the item, a palm-sized figure made of straw, meticulously bound with red and green yarn and thread. His grip on it tightened, his eyes narrowing as he began to focus. Brid paused for a moment. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. She looked at it again, and there it was, the smile. Her lips curved into the kind of grin he recognized. This was the Brid he knew, the joker, the fighter, and he knew some form of punishment was on the other side of this. Wylt Gairn, first friend, she said, almost as if it were a sudden realization. She sheathed her sword and stood upright, standing out of the fighting stand she'd fallen into, ready to wage war. No. No, Wylt echoed, his voice tight with caution. No. The racing of his heart slowed to a steady jog. His grip on the straw figure loosened just a sliver, but not too much. He remained in his fighting stance, prepared, always prepared. One of the first rules that the Orium drummed into them from their very first days as initiate adepts. She moved, almost skipping to where her blue cloak lay strewn across a rickety wooden bench. It had been laid down deliberately, longwise, taking up the entire seat. She lifted it, revealing a long wooden staff. His heart sank. He knew it well. Your wind staff isn't... No. Allowed in the... He hadn't even realized she picked it up. She moved with such finesse. She spun her wind staff swiftly as she walked back toward the center of the battle circle. To the left, to the right, behind her back. Her movements were effortless and fluid. She liked to get it to a speed where it would whistle before she began. She spun it more quickly with a deftness that always seemed almost unreal. Her eyes locked on Wylt's. No blinking, no flinching. The smile. The twirling wooden staff took on a low, almost guttural hum, then a pitch higher, and another, until... Trials? Get ready, she said, her voice playful yet edged with challenge. This isn't going to go well for you. And then she charged. The first thrust was a predictable one. Given how unconventional and erratic her fighting style was, Wylt knew her tendencies still, better than anyone. A jab. She'd use it to set up what came next. That part, the next, he didn't know. And she probably didn't either. It was a game of anticipation with her, like playing Mengen in the schoolyard on a chilly spring afternoon. A wooden board with pieces moving back and forth, relying on the other person's cleverness, or gullibility as to where to move next, before the fall. Valnar Wenveth doth cover me, he said. He didn't need to use the spoken word to cast a sage when using Gesta Totem. The straw figure he clenched tightly in his hand, nor did he need to speak them in the language of the firstkin. That was reserved for use with advents, to access their immense power. But their training, rigorous for almost 6 years now, made it a reflex in anticipation of doing just that. But this was practice, and practice is what he would do. The straw figure took on a soft blue glow, faint and instant. Then, suddenly, the glow spread across his entire body, a thin sheen that reflected the glistening of the sun streaming into the room. Shield protect. It would ensure that whatever came next, he would still be able to react swiftly. And swiftly it came. Before he knew it, a poke to the side of the knee. The wooden staff did not penetrate the barrier, but his reflex was to bend his knee anyway, just slightly, shifting his balance and placing all of his weight on his back foot. Brid, raising her windstaff overhead, spinning it quickly, then with one light slash, dropped it down and swept it at his planted foot. Immediately, Wylt went flying, his legs sprawling into the air. He crashed down onto the sawdust-covered, yet still hard, floor, the sawdust barely softening the landing. Dust filled the air, getting into his eyes and scratching his throat. When he opened his eyes, there she was, face to face, bent over at the waist, her windstaff pressed against his neck. In the commotion, he dropped the barrier, vulnerable to attack. In an instant, it was over. "Wylt Gairn," she said. "Friend." "Get off of me," he said, trying to shove her away. She pinned him down with her foot on his chest. The position was too awkward for him to move. "You know he's right, Brid," a voice sounded from across the room. It came from the direction of the archway entrance. Wylt couldn't crane his head enough to see who it was, still flat on his back, but he recognized the voice well. The upper accent, a refined lilt with a singing tone at the end. It was the tone of someone who had come through the royal courts, and one royal court specifically, that of Caelidon. "That little toy won't do you much good in the trials, let alone out in the world." "Is that so?" Brid replied. "Infinitely so," the voice returned. "Then why don't we find out, Bridain Adair?" "No." "No?" Brid led up from Wylt, standing straight now, her hand confidently grasping the windstaff, using it to prop herself up. Wylt shuffled, flipping himself over, immediately backing away. Now, able to clearly see, he saw Bridain Adair standing there, and beside him was Tenna Luth. Bridain Adair was dressed far more informally than usual, though his commanding presence remained unchanged. Perhaps he had been out cleaning the stables or making preparations for the feast later that night. Wylt didn't know which, but Bridain Adair wasn't wearing his shepherd candidate uniform. The blue tunic with silver lining and trim, as Brid was. At least 2 heads taller than nearly every other student, his dark brown skin and twisted curly black hair marked him unmistakably as one of the royal family of Caelidon. Tenna, with her straight, long black hair and shock-pale skin, her complexion indicative of the people from Omeron, stood in stark contrast beside him. She was dressed in her Magi Adept uniform, the white tunic with silver lining, covered by an equally stunning white cloak trimmed with gold. Together, they were visually striking, an imposing pair. Tenna and Bridain Adair, the 2 very best at the Orium of Mirmon men. Or so it was always whispered in the halls by the other students. "With swords," Bridain Adair said, presenting his. "Just like how it would be, out there." It took a few moments for Brid to even react. At first, she looked stone-faced, but then, the smile. "Okay," Brid said. "His Royal Majesty has decreed it so." Brid tossed her windstaff carelessly across the room. It clanged with a heavy, thudding vibration, heavier than it appeared. She unsheathed her sword and dropped into her stance. For a few moments, she seemed ready. Then she stood up, straight and tall, as though this would be no test at all. Wylt for his part, quickly moved toward the entrance beside Tenna. "Give no quarter?" Bridain Adair said. "None taken," Brid replied. Bridain Adair moved first, his long legs covering the distance in an instant. Clang! Flat-footed, Brid raised her sword and met his with a resistant push. Wylt spied a particular tell in her expression. She always seemed or appeared confident and a bit aloof, but something made him think she wasn't prepared for the sheer force of Bridain Adair's swing. "Brid," Wylt began. "Bridain Adair?" An arm reached across his chest. Tenna halted him, her gaze steady, watching the two sparring. "No," she said, a hint of intrigue in her eyes. "Let them." Bridain Adair and Brid's eyes focused on each other. He used his strength to press down on her defense. A slight tremble in her elbow betrayed her. Quickly she dropped and rolled backward to recover. Wylt expected Bridain Adair to stumble forward, but his form and stance was far too stable. Instead, he moved back slightly, repositioning himself. Then Brid, crouched and coiled, immediately strung forward. A flurry of lightning-fast strikes. The metal swords rang out over and over again as they repeatedly clashed, echoing through the room. "They're fighting?" came a dull voice from behind him, drifting in from the hallway. Wylt glanced over his shoulder to see one of the younger initiate adepts peeking around the corner. The boy was new. Wylt had yet to learn his name. He looked a bit like Wylt had at that age, 10 years old, curly brown hair slicked back to the sides, but without the smattering of freckles across his cheeks like Wylt had been, though those had faded with time. The youngling's expression shifted from shock to wide-eyed excitement. "They're fighting!" he shouted this time. "Brid and Bridain Adair are fighting!" The boy slipped away behind the entranceway so quickly, Wylt felt a rush of air filling the space he had left behind. Moments later, the sound of hurried steps echoed down the hall, followed by the raised voices and shuffle of soft leather shoes against the stone floor. The boy reappeared, this time fully entering the room. Behind him, others followed, 24 or so by Wylt's quick count, some younger, some older. They filed in, excited and rowdy, lining the edge of the battle circle, their eyes fixed in awe on Brid and Bridain Adair as the two continued their feverish dance. "Chosen!" a voice shouted as they entered the room. It was Gora Tem. His shock of ruddy hair was almost as loud as his mouth. "No, it really is happening. Chosen, did someone put you up to this?" He slapped Wylt on the back with a thick, heavy hand. Wylt hated the name, but he didn't bother to respond. Neither Bridain Adair nor Brid seemed to notice anyone present but themselves. Brid took a moment to step back, pacing back and forth as she moved to circle around. Bridain Adair remained calm and steady, not moving an inch, even as she walked behind him. He raised his blade to eye level. Wylt could tell what he was doing. Brid's distorted reflection awkwardly moved from one end of the blade to the next. Then, her reflection disappeared. Brid rushed forward, a twinkle in her eye, Bridain Adair's back still to her. Just as her blade was about to reach him, Bridain Adair stepped quickly to the right. Where Bridain Adair had been, he was no longer. Brid rushed forward, unable to catch herself, then stumbled. 1 foot, 2nd foot, leap, leap, thud. A chorus of fellow students in unison let out a long, drawn-out, "Ooh!" Brid's face smacked soundly into the wall. She staggered back, her sword dropping to the floor. Bridain Adair walked off to the side, toward the bench where Brid's cloak still lay. He kicked the bench across the floor, making a smooth whoosh as it slid over the sawdust. The bench stopped directly behind Brid. She stepped back, still trying to regain her balance, then tumbled right into it. Thunk. The back of her head landed just as hard as Wylt's had only moments earlier. The room was silent. Oddly, it was a feeling. Embarrassment. Wylt felt it. For her and for him. For she was his shepherd. It's a move we practiced and rehearsed over and over again, Brid. And yet you fell for it as though you'd never seen it, Bridain said. It's probably because she hasn't, Gora laughed. Always doing it your way, Bridain said, back to Brid again. To be honest, I feel bad for Wylt. He deserves a better companion. Wylt's heart sank at the words, but he wasn't sure if this time it wasn't despair, but anger instead, though to whom he wasn't sure. What is this? Head Magister Morn, a thick, stout, balding, and burly man draped in golden, heavy, and ornate robes, walked into the room. His deep voice snapped every last person to attention. Stiff backs, arms crossed behind at their sides. Everyone, that is, except for Brid, who remained writhing in pain still on the floor. He was barely a half-head taller than Wylt, who was always considered the runt of any group he happened to be a part of. And yet, despite the head magister's lack of physical stature, he stood before them all, intimidating and imposing nonetheless. Even to the taller-than-average Gairn, who looked up like a statue afraid to meet the man's eyes. It was his voice, Wylt thought. It boomed. Almost scary, coming from such a smaller man. You, he said, examining Gairn after assessing the scene. I expect much better from you. He then looked toward the crumpled mass of Brid. And you, well. He didn't finish. He began walking toward the entranceway. You will disperse and continue your preparation for the feast tonight, he said to the room. You will arrive 1 hour earlier for a recitation of Chapter 1 of your sages, to be spoken in the tongue of the firstkin. It will be impeccable, and it will be perfect. A groan rumbled through the room. A quick turn and glance at them all by Head Magister Morn halted it immediately. Once it is perfect, only then will you eat. Understood? Yes, Head Magister Morn, they replied in unison. Now go. The children moved en masse toward the door, with a bit of elbows and jockeying to get out one quicker than the next. All that was left was Wylt and Brid and Head Magister Morn. He gave them one more scan before exiting, shaking his head. Wylt picked up Brid's sword, and on his way to her, also gathered her windstaff. He wanted to say something clever, impactful, or meaningful, but his mind couldn't find the words in the moment. As usual, it would come to him much later, the perfect thing to say, when it was too late. In silence, instead, he tossed her weapons beside her and left. If this was a foreshadowing of the final testing tomorrow, then there would be no average trials for either of them. Then he stopped. He did think of the perfect thing to say. This was supposed to be fun, Brid, he said. And you found a way to turn it into something else yet again. She rolled her head to look at him. He shook his head in disappointment and disgust. Friend. Thank you for listening to The First Noel. Sound production by Forge Creation. The First Noel theme by Marianthi Bezaridis. Join our Patreon and Instagram at First Noel Chronicles for news and updates. And please be so wonderful to like, share, and subscribe as we journey through the world of Eos. Next time, of fractures and friendship.